All right. Um, well, welcome to today's Landscape Conservation in Action webinar hosted by the Network for Landscape Conservation. My name is John Peterson. I'm the director of the network, which is a national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative conservation and stewardship at a landscape scale. When I talk about the network, I really like to describe it as a community more than an organization. And I think of the network as a community that's connected by the shared work of collaborative landscape conservation and stewardship, and by a shared desire to see that work done better with greater impact for our landscapes and for our communities. And so really in the spirit of being a community, a lot of our work is focused on connecting people to ideas and innovations, and perhaps most importantly, to one another, so that we can collectively accelerate the pace and practice of landscape conservation and stewardship. And that's really what we're hoping to do today. We're really thrilled to be able to be partnering with Trees, Water, and People to spotlight a short film that they've recently produced called In the Right Hands, and follow up and dig into conversation with colleagues. And so I think in the interest of moving into conversation as quickly as possible, I think I'll leave it there with only a word of framing maybe around we so often talk about in this field that work moves at the speed of trust. And that's super easy to say, but what does that actually look like in practice? How do we actually do that? And what does it take to resource that work? And that's really the space that Trees, Water, and People have explored with their film. And that's the conversation we're so excited to be able to have with you all today. Um, we're super fortunate to be able to have three amazing panelists with us today. And it's really unfair to flatten any of these individuals to simply a name and job title. But I'm going to do that, unfortunately, in the interest of time and digging into conversation as quickly as possible, knowing full well that they're who they are as people and how they think and orient to the world will come through deeply in their remarks and thoughts as we move into discussion with them. And so with that, let me just introduce our three panelists. We have Jordana Barrick, who is the executive director of the Mighty Arrow Foundation. We have Chaz Robles, who is the executive director of the Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps. And then lastly, we have Sebastian Africano, who is the executive director of Trees, Water, and People. Sebastian and Jordana, I believe, are both joining from Colorado and Chaz from New Mexico. So welcome to you. We're going to start with a short screening of a trailer for the film and then jump into discussion. And so, Sebastian, do you want to sort of just provide a little bit of context to introduce the film?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. It's great to be here and part of this community. Trees, Water, and People has been in the conservation space and restoration space for 27 years. We work in the Western U.S. And in Central America and Mexico. And let me just start off by saying, I know we've had a really rough week in our sector. A lot of people are going through some tough times, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the space. And we think that makes this conversation all the more important and timely. We've been working for many years to change the relationship with our donors. We're about a $2.5 million organization, and we work through networks. We're conveners. We bring together organizations on the ground level doing great work, be that tribal natural resource departments in the U.S., other nonprofits, federal agencies, state agencies, et cetera, and then private philanthropy to try to achieve big things with flexible thinking, right? And so anyone that's been in the nonprofit space has been, subjected to grants that are very short term, that have very transactional metrics, are focused on outputs, dollars of things in X amount of time. and are very rigid in how they're approached. And when we had a really disruptive societal shock during the COVID years. Everybody was going through that shock at the same time. So it opened an opportunity for us to talk to our funders about being more flexible, thinking about the long term objectives of our work and outcomes that we want to see, and not tying ourselves too closely on how it was going to go and in what time frame. And today we find ourselves in a similar situation, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. The federal government and federal funds and agencies are all frozen. We don't know what's going to come back. We don't know what's going to go forward. We don't know how priorities are going to shift. We do know that a lot of people are losing jobs. There's a lot of displacement, disorientation, and I think that's part of the strategy. But without going down that rabbit hole, it really opens up a conversation and an opportunity for us to approach private funders. We're going to all rely on private funding to really move our objectives forward. And why conservation? Conservation is an uncertain enterprise in the best of circumstances right now in the era of climate change, mega fires, exceptional drought. It's really difficult to say what's going to happen and when, right? And and a lot of the work depends on relationships with communities. So the work moves at the speed of trust with communities. And when the speed of your relationships at the community level aren't aligned with the speed and expectations of your funding sources, that can create a mismatch, and can create turbulence, and also be counterproductive in the objectives we're trying to reach. And so we put together this film in the right hands in that spirit of saying, isn't it time that we started to acknowledge that we're in uncharted territory, that we're dealing with challenges that are much bigger than us, that require big picture thinking, long term and long time horizons, and collaborative partnerships as peers in trying to solve these problems, and not a top down, prescriptive, and restricted approach to questions and challenges that are really centuries in the making. And so, in the right hands is in that spirit. And just to provide a little more context, um, foundation giving and private giving in the U.S. For the years that I was able to pull some data in 2023. It was about $560 billion in grants that were made from private sources. About 2/3 of those came from individuals. About 18% came from foundations. Um, if we take the 103 billion that foundations gave in 2023, and realize that foundations legally are required to donate 5% of their corpus per year, they donated about 7 that year. There's about $1.5 trillion in philanthropic funds sitting on the sidelines in endowments, trust, foundation accounts. And then on the individual level is about $250 billion in donor advised funds accounts. These are funds that individuals have already received a tax break for and are permanently earmarked for philanthropic contribution. And so trust-based philanthropy says, knowing that there's all this capital on the sidelines, what kind of proposals can we make given the current environment and uncertainty, and also the nature of the challenges, to really form partnerships with more of these philanthropic entities, and encourage them to make that funding more available, and less restricted, and kind of focus on long-term objectives versus short-term outcomes. And that's the nature of this film. So rather than show you the 10-minute film, which is on our website at twp.org/trust, we encourage you to watch that and share it, right? It's a tool for everyone to help start these conversations with their funders. We're going to show the trailer and just try to get you a little inspired, and then switch gears into a conversation with Jordana and Chaz, who are both in the film. And also take a lot of your questions about how to start working in a more trust-based way with your funders and your community partners, and how that can improve philanthropy and our overall outcomes over the next several years. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jose to start the trailer.
I think that there is a lot of fear in philanthropy around making the wrong grant, about doing something where it could be revealed that this money went the wrong place, it wasn't used the way that it was supposed to be used. And that fear, I think, is what drives the traditional way of grant making.
This work is built on relationships, and that's something that we talk about, in our traditional ways. We sit down, we have meals, we share meals.
It's not necessarily the end product, it's about the process.
And we as natives, we manage our forest areas.
Trust-based philanthropy, I believe we've always had it in our communities. We've always believed in one another to do good work and support each other.
If a funder or philanthropist is interested in addressing a challenge or an opportunity in a community, it must be informed by the people who are experiencing the challenge or the opportunity.
If you trust the organization, why not let them allocate the funds where they want?
It's incredibly beneficial to our program. It allows us to plan years in advance as opposed to constantly sort of scrambling around to secure enough project work and funding.
I guess the best way for me to describe it, you do this work from your heart. And if you do it from your heart, then it expands and extends to everybody that you work with.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for providing that framing and introduction of the film. And it's such a beautiful trailer. And Jordana, Chaz, please, yeah, excellent coming back on screen. I think the film really is such a beautiful invitation into a space of reflection and a space of conversation. And I think that's exactly what we want to lean into today. Please, if you we shared the link in the webinar for the full film. Please find a moment to find 10 minutes to watch it. It really is a powerful film. But really excited to welcome you all three of you into a conversation right now. For those of you in the audience, please use the chat throughout and chime in with your reflections, your observations, and your questions too. We really want to make sure this can be a dynamic conversation amongst us as a community. We'll take about 30 minutes just to have a bit of a panel conversation, and then hope to save the last 10 or 15 minutes to start to pick up many of what I'm sure are going to be fantastic questions that emerge from all of you. So again, please use the chat and join the conversation. But I really wanted to start and, picking up on Sebastian on a lot of what you touched on in your opening, and the film really speaks to this beautifully too. Um, the sort of prevailing paradigms for how we resource conservation and stewardship work in many ways are poorly aligned with a lot of the community grounded trust-based work that is really critical to empowering communities to chart positive futures for their landscapes and their communities. And so I wanted to sort of lean into that and spend a little bit of time thinking about that as we get started. And so thinking about maybe Chaz and Sebastian, I'll start with you as sort of coming from the practitioner side, but what does it look like to really bring forward those trust-based practices to your work? And when you really can approach your work from trust-based perspectives, when you have the resources from partners, funding partners to really lean into that trust-based approach, how does that change the essence of your work? How does that change your approach? Yeah, I would love to sort of hear more from both of you on that front.
Yeah, thank you, John. I mean, I think it fundamentally changes the approach and certainly the impact of the work on the ground. We've been fortunate within Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps to cultivate a lot more trust-based relationships with philanthropic and foundational partners over the past few years. And where we see the most direct impact is to our participants in communities on the ground, the work on the ground. We get more of the resources that we need, and we can direct more of those resources to our participants, to our programming, to the field, and to the communities that we work with. And it allows us to meet community need more directly as well, to work with community to create the solutions to the challenges or the problems that our communities and partners are facing, and to really innovate and the solutions to that. It removes a lot of the barriers that historically I think we've seen with when we're working with philanthropy and foundations, when we're grant writing. Really streamlining that process, and there's a lot less of that having to really force our programming within the molds of what our philanthropic and foundational partners are looking for, and more of that organic problem solving and innovation. It's really opened the doors for us to work with community, and a great example of an area within our program that's really flourished with our trust-based approaches and partnerships has been our traditional farm corps, which was created in the Pueblo of Acoma to engage local youth and young people in traditional agricultural practices, to grow food, healthy food, to make that food more accessible, to support local tribal food sovereignty and overall community sovereignty, by providing that local food, keeping those traditions alive, and keeping access to those heirloom and landrace varieties of food that have been grown since time immemorial, but was really being threatened of being lost. For those traditions and practices to continue, and seeing that program, really gain a foothold through support that we've gotten from our philanthropic partners, but then also to really evolve and grow and flourish, and to be able to take that to other communities like the Pueblo of Isleta and the Pueblo of Zuni. So it really just opens up so many opportunities and doors for us to really be authentic in our programming, to meet community need head on, and then also to see that flourish and grow and expand in its impact.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that, and add that it also allows you to flex to changing realities in the communities, right? In the Pueblo communities that we work with in trying to restore burn areas, governments change every 12 months, and so your relationships are everything, right? If you're really making an effort to move forward restoration work on tribal lands and tribal adjacent ancestral lands, those relationships are your through line to getting anything done, right? And it becomes less about the numbers of things that you do per dollar in X amount of time, but really how you cultivated that relationship. Because once that's you have that foundation, you can achieve impact in so many different realms. We learned during COVID in Central America, we worked with an indigenous community that was trying to protect their ancestral forests from development and were under severe threat. And we had several reforestation grants to fund the reforestation parts of their mission. And they were all very quantitative and great sources of funding, we thought. But then one day they said, we're trying to protect acres, thousands of acres of forests. And the more time we spend, on our hands and knees trying to figure out how many of our little seedlings survived, when we know that fire season's right around the corner, when we know there's poachers in the woods, when we know there's developers eyeing our territory, that's time that we're not spending on the macro things, on the big things. And it was a big aha moment where we went back to a funder and we said, you know what, this isn't going to work for us anymore. And we're literally missing the forest for the trees in this situation. And as a result, we were able to really focus on what the organization needed, where they were, what the biggest threats were in the moment during political shifts and otherwise, and really shift our approach and strategy. And the end result was that we passed into Honduran law a new protected area protecting 12,600 acres from any future development, and co-managed by the local community. And so, when we talk about impact, that's the foundation on which impact can can be built, right? But without that, everything is constantly at risk and you're constantly spinning your wheels. And so listening to the real needs and shifting your philanthropic capital to respond to those needs and to be responsive to the people on the ground doing the work is a really big benefit of trust-based philanthropy.
Yeah, Chaz, jump in. And
Well, I just wanted to point out there's a great question that somebody put in the chat, and I think it's important to start with that, like defining what we're talking about with trust-based philosophy, or excuse me, philanthropy. I know there's like a formal definition out there, but when I think of trust-based philanthropy, it is very much rooted in that relationships, the relationships that we build with our partners, our funders, and it's creating a more even playing field within that dynamic. We use the word partnerships and partners very intentionally, but historically, like that power dynamic has been with the grantors, right? The people with the money, and we as practitioners and nonprofits and organizations have typically, we go into those relationships not on that equal playing field. But I think the one of the main goals and objectives of trust-based philanthropy is evening out that playing field. It's recognizing that it is a symbiotic relationship. The foundations and the funders need the programs as much as we need them and their resources and their funds. And it recognizes that. I would also say removing those barriers through simplifying and streamlining the application process is a critical element of trust-based philanthropy. And then on the back end, we're used to a lot of those strings being attached to those funds, and trying to remove as much of those strings as possible. And again, trusting that we as programs are utilizing those funds in the way that we're talking about to make that impact on the ground. It's not writing a blank check, right? Because there, as Henry Rael talked about in the film, like there's that real fear for funders and foundations that the money's going to be misappropriated or misused. So it's not just like, here's the money, do what you want. There's still that reporting element. But as we've seen our foundational partners really work with us to meet us in this trust-based approach, that reporting takes different forms. Sometimes it's them coming out to the field to see that impact firsthand, and talk to our participants, talk to our community members, and hear about that impact and see that. And that's going to be way more, they're going to get a much better picture of that rather than some report that I write at the end, that's real stuffy and doesn't have the vibrancy and the life, that we're doing every day. Or storytelling, really embracing that storytelling, impact stories, firsthand accounts, and things like that. And so, I think those are some elements that really come to the forefront for me, when I'm thinking about trust-based philanthropy.
yeah, thanks so much, Chaz. And I have a feeling even your reports have a lot of vibrancy and life into them. And and so, but it's such a great point. And thank you for pausing and picking that up. And Jordan, I feel like this is the perfect time to welcome your voice into the conversation too, and maybe just hear some reflections from you around what does trust-based philanthropy look like in practice? And maybe starting there, and then also would love to hear more too from you in a similar vein to what we just heard from Sebastian and Chaz around, how does when you approach your partners through that trust-based perspective as a funder, how do you see that impacting their approach and the work that they're doing through their programs?
Certainly, John. Thanks for the question. And Chaz, thanks for your description of trust-based philanthropy. And it really resonated with me when you talk about how do we have this experience together as more of a rewarding way to measure the work that's being done. And I guess when I think about trust-based philanthropy to start with, I just think it's just a more interesting and more rewarding way to work in general, period. And so for Mighty Arrow, trust-based philanthropy is, I guess you could say that's what we practice now, but we kind of started there a long time ago, and kind of have ended up in trust-based philanthropy, but we sort of started there in the beginning. And that comes from I work for the family that started New Belgium Brewing Company. They were very entrepreneurial and weren't afraid to make up business as they went. And so with their philanthropy, they have also allowed us to kind of make things up as they go. And they didn't want to hire someone that had previous experience with philanthropy as they decided how to develop their best practices. And for myself, when I came into the foundation, I sort of inherited a portfolio of partners. And through that, I kind of knew that my first task was to go get to know the people that we were funding. And instead of spending time developing a strategy, trying to figure out subject matter or running around with other funders, it was like, let's just go in the field and spend time together. And honestly, that was the most influential part of me learning what philanthropy was supposed to be like. And so early on in our days, by spending time with our nonprofit partners, we learned that general operating funds was really important by giving up some of the control. And we also recognize that we're not of the size foundation that we can underwrite an entire program for an organization. And so because of that, we do general operating funds to just support the organization in general so that they can decide what needs to be done best. So then a few years later, we started to realize that, oh, multi-year commitments are really important to our organizations. And so we started to sign up, and now about 90% of our portfolio is in a multi-year commitment. And my favorite part of this is that it sort of locks us into a relationship together for a few years. We do 3-year commitments. And so when it comes to the end of the year, our partners don't have to say, well, what do we tell them to make sure we get this next grant? And try to tell us things that we think we want to hear. Instead, we can say, what are you really wrestling with? And us as a funder get to be a true partner. And I think, Sebastian, you mentioned the word partner, or maybe Chaz, it was you. And it's like, what does that really mean to be a partner in this work together? And I think part of it is recognizing the people for who they are as well. I think a bit about, there was a line I heard in the venture capital world that said, great people make great investments. And I have certainly come to recognize that for us at Mighty Arrow, we move our money based on a person inside an organization or program that told us about that organization and program, but ultimately it was that person that inspired us to move our capital. And so if that's the case, why aren't we doing a better job of taking care of those people at the same time? And I think actually that's the next phase that trust-based philanthropy needs to move even further into. So I'll pause with that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jordan. I really appreciate those insights and what that looks like from the funder side. Sebastian and Chaz, I was struck by something you both spoke to, I think, in your reflections around when you bring trust-based approaches to work and really orient from that perspective as you do your work, it allows you to move into a space where it's so much easier to see the interconnections that happen sort of in the biophysical and sociocultural world. And Chaz, you spoke beautifully to meeting the community need, and Sebastian recognizing how context shifts and how that, what was a clear community need 6 months ago may not be the highest priority need now because of X, Y, or Z. And so, I think that that's certainly something that came through in listening to your remarks and sort of encourages me to think about that question of impact. And I think oftentimes some of the pushback you hear around trust-based approaches and trust-based philanthropy really comes from that perspective of, well, what's the return on investment? How is this really results oriented? And if we're trying to set out to solve this issue, are we going to see that return on investment that convinces us we're making progress? And so, I would think this is a question for all three of you to reflect on, but would really love to hear, as Sebastian and Chaz, as you're approaching funders and as you're talking about your work, how do you talk about the impact of the work? And Jordana, from your perspective as a funder and operating, amongst a peer circle of other funders and philanthropy, how do you talk about the impact that you're seeing, and especially maybe editorializing on my end, that multifaceted impact that I think is really at the root of transformative work in community for people and place. Anyone want? I don't know I think there's a question in there somewhere. Sebastian, you want to pick it up first?
Sure. It's a really complex question. I think that's where the opportunity lies in creating the partnership with the funder, right? And setting the expectations from the outset and understanding the bigger vision of the community. And just to speak to the question on the chat, I think this applies worldwide in conservation, US wise. And yeah, the statistics that I mentioned earlier were US philanthropy based, but I think setting the expectation is important, really. When we're thinking about the degradation of forests and the pine beetle epidemic in the West and the mega fires that we're seeing, these are all events that were kind of the results of centuries of decisions, right? And in restoring something like that to get a watershed to function, if we go down to the community need, suddenly water availability, water quality is starting to be restricted. There's landslides, sediment, loss of topsoil. It starts to affect livelihoods and agriculture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When we frame the impact of a year-long grant in terms of, how many acres did we treat, how many trees did we plant, how many people did we employ, I think we minimize the overall importance and the grander objective of the work, right? Is to really restore that watershed so that centuries from now, millennia from now, 7 generations from now, those communities still have access to water and to their livelihoods and traditional ways of being, right? Ceremonial, traditional, cultural. And so when we frame it in that regard and think, generations ahead about what we're trying to achieve in the interest of the community, it really changes the conversation with the philanthropist. Like that doesn't really fit neatly into a logistical framework that's based on output thinking and what we think we might accomplish a year from now. If we during COVID were held to just those restrictive kind of measures and metrics of progress or success, it would have looked like nothing was really going on, either in our Central America work, where we ended up establishing that National Wildlife Reserve, or in New Mexico, where we ended up forming a partnership with 3 pueblos in the Santa Fe National Forest to conduct 5 years of restoration work within the national forest. But what that looked like over several years was lots of meetings, lots of conversations, not a lot of tree planting, not a lot of acres treated, but some on-site work, lots of on-site field visits, lots of strategizing, lots of politicizing. And when you're dealing with a multi-jurisdictional situation, fires don't know jurisdictional lines, and fences get burned, and who's in charge of what. It gets even more complex. And so retraining the focus on the horizon and that long-term objective is step one in kind of getting to an agreement with your funders of, okay, let's agree what we're really working on here, and understand that it may not be linear. Progress may not be linear, and it may be happening on several fronts at once. And if we focus on the outputs only, we're missing the bigger picture. So I'll just leave it there and pass it to Chaz and Jordana.
Yeah. Thank you, Sebastian. And there's a good question too that came up in the chat. There are a lot of great questions in the chat, but one directly related to this question: how do you evaluate success without metrics? And as Sebastian was talking about, we're creating metrics because we have plenty of very quantifiable metrics and data that we can collect, whether it's acres or miles or community members, economic metrics, et cetera. But I think, from this trust-based lens, we're also looking at the qualitative data and valuing the qualitative data and those direct impact stories, whether it's a participant that comes into our program and they're sharing their story about their journey, reconnecting with those agricultural practices or reconnecting to those sacred and significant cultural spaces through the work that they're doing with us and how that's impacting them personally, how that's creating that opportunity to reconnect with their stories, with their culture, with their traditions, and then to continue the legacy of their ancestors of actually managing and working with and living with the land in those ways. I think that's, we're expanding that lens and zooming out to see it's not only about those quantifiable metrics, it's also about that qualitative data and the impact, from the broader community, like Sebastian was talking about too, recognizing the longer term aspect of that, which can be difficult when we have 1 or 2 or 3 year funding. But I think it's a really important approach that we take, and it's a great opportunity as well for us to, continue to focus on those metrics, but expand out and bring in some of those elements, from our perspectives as land-based and indigenous people that we can bring in from that, incorporate those elements of the circular time frame and those longer term impacts as well. So, and that's something that's critical again for folks to come out into the field. And I know there's another question in the chat too, like sometimes our funders don't have the time. But I think that's a way, with this trust-based approach, it's about accountability on both sides, right? We're accountable as these programs that are receiving these funds and utilizing those appropriately and in a way that's going to create some of those impacts and deliverables and achieve those metrics that we're talking about. But also looking to our partners, and their accountability is, we're inviting you, we want you to come out into the field and that's going to help, strengthen the relationship. It's going to help to explain those impacts again in ways that, we can certainly share through the storytelling. We can certainly share in reports, but it makes a much bigger impact when you can see that and hear that firsthand.
Thanks, Chaz and Sebastian. Honestly, I don't think I'm a good one to answer how to measure impact as a funder, because we're not very good at collecting data. And I know that we are the minority in that, and that other funders are looking for that information. But Sebastian, I've heard you twice now mention pushing back at funders in order to establish what is agreed upon. And I think that's really important. And to be honest, as a funder, I have learned and advanced the most in my work when our nonprofit partners have asked me for those types of things, who have asked me, do you do this? Or is this okay? And it's really made us stop and think about, oh, well, maybe we should start considering that. And I've also heard you speak about what does it look like for a nonprofit to set the terms of a grant agreement. And I think that's something that we should be talking about. And I also want to acknowledge that there is a power dynamic between funders and practitioners, and that it's scary to ask for those things. At Mighty Arrow, we've experimented a little bit with how do we inspire other funders to be willing to make multi-year commitments. And so we've thrown these challenge grants out to some of our partners to say, okay, we will double down and commit to another 3 years if you can find another funder to sign up for that 3-year commitment. And everyone's been successful in different ways, but some of the feedback I've gotten is I never knew it was okay to ask a funder for a multi-year commitment. And so I think it takes practice to develop the courage to ask for those things, but you got to start trying if we want to change the way that this system is operating. So I guess I would just encourage folks out there to take the risk and to ask your funders. Sebastian, yeah, jump in. I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, I raised my hand. I almost never do that, but yeah, you got my gears turning. One of the other, and I love the challenge. I mean, the challenge directly from a progressive and forward-thinking funder for us to start that conversation, because really this is a movement and courage. This is not the mainstream. This is still very fringe, the trust-based philanthropy movement, you could say. And in a couple of years, you know, the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, who kind of started the conversation and really got it to grow on a national basis. They don't want to be called the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. They just want philanthropy to work more on a level playing field, right? But one of the, you know, one of Chaz's earlier points, funding comes with a lot of strings attached. When we were growing as an organization, and as organizations grow, and you get funding from more and more sources, and those sources all have strings attached, you start to get tied up in knots, right? To kind of keep on with that metaphor. And that the biggest people to feel that strain are your staff and your team and your organization. And it really prevents you from pursuing what is, and you know, that goes for reporting, that goes for communications, that goes for executing on the grant terms on the ground with the communities. And when you're serving so many different I think, you know, kind of hierarchies of need and demands, it can get very, very messy, and it can get very, very stressful on your staff. And that starts to show up in as burnouts, and it starts to really affect the internal operation of the organization. So just in terms of, you know, making the argument that we're going to be able to do a better job if you leave us alone, and just kind of let us approach the work. Let's agree on the objective we're trying to meet together, and let's agree on how we can report on our progress in a meaningful way. But you know, beyond that, we need to really work on this problem. These are difficult problems, right? In a way that makes sense for our team and our organization's capacity and for the community's priorities. And if we can work in that way, this is going to be a very successful relationship. And there's a lot of questions on, like, how do you start that process? And do they have to have a connection to the specific issue at hand or specific watershed that you're working on? I'd say no, right? You know, if they're aligned with the general purpose, be it conservation in general, restoration or fire or science or international causes and development or indigenous causes and development. I mean, I think that sets the stage for a conversation on, okay, we understand that your goal is this, and the way that we can most meaningfully approach this problem is by really thinking in 3 to 5 year time spans, right? And not minimizing the challenge that we're trying to solve into you know, year-long grant cycles based on outputs and micrometrics. So yeah, you have metrics, but I think the objective governs the metrics, and the metrics shift based on community priority and context. And to Jordana's point, I mean, this is a really an exercise in courage, and having the courage to kind of level that playing field. I said before that, you know, of all philanthropic giving, about 2/3 came from individuals, about 18% came from foundations, about 15% came from corporations. Guess who's sitting at the desks in foundations and corporations? It's individuals, right? And so it's really building the relationship, having the courage to ask questions, having the courage to ask for a meeting and tell, you know, and speak to what's not going right and how you think we can approach it differently. But it's a human to human exchange and relationship that you build with. And it's not easy. I mean, there's no prescription or blueprint for this, but it really starts at just having the conversation, asking the questions, and also saying what you and your staff need to do this job well.
And Sebastian, you touched on burnout, and I guess I would encourage us as a community to continue to think about what are the other things to push back on. And I think of grant reporting. You know, I feel like that is something that started because of an IRS requirement a long time ago, and it's become a standard and has evolved into this really deep and strenuous process. And how can we start asking funders, hey, will you accept a grant report, a standardized grant report? And like, how do we look at some of those things that funders are putting more work on our nonprofit partners, when I think the intention is not to create work for you, because we want to be funding you to go out and do the work that you're supposed to do. And so what are the other ways that we can also push back? I'm inviting you to push back.
And I wanted to just build off that. I know we want to leave some time for, there's some great questions in the chat and the Q&A, but one last thing, we've been talking, you know, really focused on the funding that comes from our philanthropic partners. But to Jordana's point, especially around burnout, one thing I've seen from that really come from that trust-based approach are additional resources. So in addition to the funding that comes in to support our work on the ground, there are a lot more other resources, whether it's convenings and bringing organizations and practitioners together to build those relationships and create more opportunity for collaboration, bringing additional funders to the table. Also, there's been a lot of focus on wellness resources, workshops, webinars, giving trainings to boards of directors and to staff. I think a lot of that is something that we oftentimes overlook because we're so focused. We need the money to do the work, right? But along with that, we've seen a real influx of all these other incredible resources that support us as individuals and staff and people, as well as our organizations and the work that we're doing. So that's something that's been really, really exciting to see coming over these past few years.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chaz, for bringing that forward. I spend a lot of time thinking about um, the need to steward our own human resource, and to your point, all of you have spoken to the demands that really complex, challenging work places on us as individuals, and the risk of burnout, and thinking about how trust-based approaches to investing. Jordan, I loved your reflection on great people make great investments, and if we're making investments, it's because we believe in people, and how can we really support them in stewarding their own individual human resource? Because the reality is, now more than ever, we need folks doing this work, and we need to make sure they can sustain themselves over the long term. So thank you so much for sharing your reflections. And I think, sharing reflections on how we can start to shift norms. The system does not, this is, Sebastian, I think you called it a fringe movement, right? How can we collectively, as individual practitioners, as organizations, continue to push this forward in ways that elevate it? And I heard a lot of you already speak to that. I think this is a great time to start to pick up some of the fantastic questions that have been coming in through the chat, and would encourage folks to use the chat and the Q&A. I think we're monitoring both of those, and so chime in with your thoughts. But a lot of questions on sort of the how of this, and Sebastian, you and others have already started to speak to this. But would love just sort of some reflections on starting to build that relationship with funders. Is it through storytelling and qualitative metrics? How does that start? And I think something that you shared, Sebastian, that really resonated was sort of the objective governs the metrics, but sort of where do you start as you think about building that relationship?
I'm going to answer two questions at once, because there's one from Jody in the chat about creative reporting processes. I think that one thing that Mighty Arrow has done amazingly well with us is to challenge us to invite in other funders, and say, use Mighty Arrow as kind of a stake. Say, hey, we have a funder that's offering us this, if we can find another funder that will match their terms, right? And those terms are, unrestricted, multi-year, and we were able to do that. And then on the reporting side, it's inviting funders, say, maybe a prospective funder, hey, we're going to be reporting on our progress in this program that we're working on with Mighty Arrow Family Foundation or whoever else. Would you like to join the Zoom call and just hear where we're at and what we're facing, and the progress we've made? And so just having an open door and inviting people. There's a really powerful statement in the film that I encourage you all to watch, where it's really more of an invitation, right? It's an invitation to do philanthropy in a different way. And like Jordana said, it's a gift also to the foundations, right? Of not having to track all these micro metrics that might not really contribute to the overall picture of success that you're trying to create. And so it's really starting that conversation and saying, this is what we want to focus on over the next X number of years. Will you partner with us on this objective? We think that it's aligned with how you operate and what your goals are as a foundation. And if you'd like to see what we've done so far, please join us for this call. We'll be reporting out to another partner foundation, obviously with their permission, but what we found is that once you start that trust-based relationship with one funder or two funders, it can snowball from there, and people start to understand the value of it. And the film is also created in a peer-to-peer format. Most of the people interviewed are our funders, right? And telling the audience what's beneficial about this approach to them.
Yeah, and I think looking to our, and so I love that how you pose that, Jordana, is, you know, it's that invitation and that challenge to us to utilize and leverage the resources from one organization and expand that. And then we also like to flip that challenge or that question to our partners as well, because we know that the philanthropic community, there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of connectivity, right? And there may be that opportunity, and I think that holds a lot more weight. One of the questions in the chat is, we oftentimes have to apply or submit letters of interest or inquiry or be invited and that sort of thing. And it can be hard to have the staff and the resources to do all that research and find those opportunities, and then constantly be submitting those letters of inquiry and interest, and maybe have a 5 to 10% return that actually we're invited to or are funded. And really relying upon those strong networks that exist within philanthropy. And if there's maybe a proposal that's submitted that doesn't quite fit with one organization or foundation, to ask our partners for that support and pass that on, or to say, hey, we've had great success working with this program and organization. We think that this foundation would be a great fit to support your work too. Like, those sorts of introductions hold a ton of weight, and it also, again, removes that burden from the programs that we're hyper focused on the work that we're doing on the ground, that impact that we're having in the communities and with our participants, and it kind of brings that shared and collaborative approach as well. So that's one way that's been really successful, that we've seen drive that impact when our founders and our partners have that those conversations and pass those impacts along and make those introductions.
I will say storytelling matters, especially in today's world. Like, the more you can, and I really want to acknowledge all the resources that it takes, both to put these things out in the world, even to monitor an Instagram page, let alone host a funder in the field, all those things, time, money, energy. But they do work. And, I have found new organizations to fund based on Instagram. And some of the other ways that I have engaged with new organizations is when they invite me in, and maybe they invite me in because the initial contact is more asking for advice. It's not asking for funding, but it's asking for, hey, like, we see that you have value and we just want to start with a perspective on something. But that starts a relationship. And I think about, I'm on the board of a small watershed organization here in Fort Collins, and we were trying to find a board member that had some deeper business acumen experience. And our network wasn't really bringing anything to us. And so we thought about, well, let's reach out to the local community foundation and ask them if they have a donor in their network with business experience that wants to come join our board. And what we ended up with was a member of the community foundation that wanted to join the board, which is huge for our networking for that organization. And so it kind of started with just a curious question, and inviting people in to be part of, like, hey, can you help us work through this or figure this thing out? And I think that gives people purpose, and that makes them want to engage more. But I also want to acknowledge just how much time and resources it does take to try to get in front of a funder.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jordana, for offering that perspective. And I think it is really powerful to think of the opportunity to engage with funders initially through that thought partnership perspective, and recognizing that they too are practitioners and have a sometimes unique vantage point, and being able to see across a suite of organizations and differing perspectives. recognizing we have about 5 minutes left, I wish we had booked 2 hours for this conversation. It's been so rich, and there's so much to continue to explore around how to shift norms and elevate this practice as more central to our our paradigm of how we resource and support and invest in conservation and stewardship work. It is so critical and so foundational to its success. But I think in the interest of time, we'll leave it there for now. Let me just thank Sebastian, Jordana, Chaz. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. Thanks to all of you in the audience for engaging so deeply in your questions. We'll capture these questions and circulate them amongst the panelists, and make sure folks have contact information as well if there's follow-ups. But such an important conversation. Truly value having Sebastian, Jordana, and Chaz carve out some time to join us and share some thoughts. A last word from Jordana or Chaz briefly, and then I'm going to pivot to Sebastian to close us out.
Sure. I am going to take a moment for a shameless plug, and I see only because I see the last question in the Q&A about how do we help current funders change how they think about things. That's something that Mighty Arrow is really trying to figure out, is how do we influence other funders. And the first week of March, we're actually going to be releasing a report that's just free on our website to talk more about feedback from our partners on what trust-based philanthropy practices look like, what burnout looks like, and and our audience is geared towards the funders. Like, how do we educate them? So that'll be a resource that you guys can grab and share with your funders as to, hey, look, here's an example of someone that's trying something different. So.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jordan. We'll have to schedule webinar number 2 with that report, perhaps. Chaz, a final word?
Yeah, I think especially in the current times and environment that we're experiencing right now, our organization, about 2/3 of our funding is from the federal government, and I'm getting stop work orders daily, and that's having a direct impact to our folks that are on the ground, right? At the end of the day, what we're left with when that funding goes away is our relationships, and trust-based philanthropy is rooted in relationships. Now, I'm not asking our foundational partners to cover those gaps that we're, seeing impacted from the federal government, but what they are doing, what they're stepping up to do, and what we're hoping they continue to do is providing some of that support that's going to ease that impact on our young folks, on our participants, on our community members, and support that work during these difficult times. So, it's incredible to have those relationships, and again, it takes time to build that trust and to build and develop those relationships. But at the end of the day, that's what we have. That's the foundation, is through those partnerships and those relationships. So it is a really worthwhile investment of our time.
Beautifully said, Chaz. Sebastian, why don't we turn it to you to close us out?
Yeah, it's hard to wrap it all up, and I wish we had some more time, but yeah, overall, conservation is a long-term, it's the long game, right? We're thinking about things over multi-generations. Most of the impacts of our work we won't be around to see or enjoy, right? But hopefully we're doing this with future generations in mind. And I think when we engage with funders that want to fund our work, whether it be for the social outcomes, the economic outcomes, or the environmental and conservation outcomes, the conversation's the same. Like, we're trying to leave the world better than we found it, and we're trying to put resources to good use. And the people who best know how those resources need to be used, and the people most motivated to ensure that their communities are safe and provided for in the future are those community members themselves, whether they're indigenous communities, wherever they are in the U.S. And so really listening to local populations, understanding the local context and the local motivations, and having that be on an equal footing with the nonprofit and the staff implementing the work and the funder is, I think, where we make the most progress as a community. And so that's the essence of trust-based philanthropy. I encourage you to watch the full film at twp.org/trust. And reach out, let us know what you think, and let us know how we can be helpful. A lot of this is happening organically in terms of how we're approaching funders, but in an era of such uncertainty, both on the funding level, and on the climate level and the difficulties we're encountering in the field. We need to be creative, and we need to have courage, and we need to stand up for what we're working on, right? And have the courage to think about it in different ways. So I encourage you to have those conversations and to knock on the door of your next of your next prospective funder and ask for advice, to ask to start a conversation, and those conversations will bear fruit in the future.
What a beautiful way to wrap up, Sebastian. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.